Chrome gleamed under the unforgiving West Texas sun, reflecting a harsh world that 7-year-old Rosie Mercer barely understood. Highway 385 cut through the barren landscape of Odessa like a long gray scar that refused to heal. On either side, the earth stretched out in every direction, flat and merciless, baked to a pale, cracked brown by a July heat that had no intention of showing mercy to anyone. The sky above was a savage blue, not a single cloud offering even the thinnest promise of shade or rain. Out here, the land itself seemed hostile, as though it resented the small, stubborn clusters of humanity that dared to cling to its surface. Inside the Rusty Spoon diner, the air conditioning unit rattled and groaned in a futile losing battle against the sweltering midday heat. The machine had been dying a slow death for years, and the best it could manage was a lukewarm wheeze that barely disturbed the thick, greasy air inside the restaurant. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, pushing the smell of burnt coffee and old bacon grease in slow circles around the room. Elaine Mercer sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, her trembling hands wrapped around a porcelain coffee mug that had gone cold over an hour ago. She stared through the grimy window at the empty parking lot, but she wasn't really seeing anything. Her mind was somewhere far away, trapped in a spiral of numbers and deadlines and terror that had become the background noise of her existence. She was 28 years old, but the last 2 years had aged her a hard decade. The dark circles under her hazel eyes had become permanent residents. Her cheekbones, once soft and full, now pressed sharply against skin that had grown thin from too many skipped meals. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and her cotton dress, washed so many times the floral pattern had faded to a ghostly suggestion of color, hung loosely on her diminished frame. Across the table, Rosie swung her small legs back and forth, her worn sneakers not quite reaching the floor. She was bent over a coloring book, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in fierce concentration as she worked a purple crayon across the page. Her cornflower blue eyes were bright and enormous in her small face, completely untouched by the catastrophic weight that was slowly crushing her mother from the inside out. 2 years ago, Elaine's world had been small but solid. Garrett Mercer, her husband, had been a safety inspector at the Apex Petrochemical Refinery on the outskirts of town. He was a quiet, methodical man who believed that doing the right thing was not a choice but an obligation. He didn't gamble. He didn't drink more than the occasional beer on a Friday evening. He came home every night, kissed his wife, read his daughter a bedtime story, and fell asleep with the kind of deep, exhausted peace that comes from honest physical work. Then on a scorching Tuesday afternoon in September, 2 years before this moment in the diner, Garrett Mercer had fallen from a catwalk inside the refinery's main processing tower. The official report stated that he had bypassed a safety railing and lost his footing. Gross negligence, they called it, a tragic but preventable accident caused by the victim's own recklessness. The words had been a slap across Elaine's face. Garrett, the most careful man she had ever known, the man who triple-checked smoke detectors and insisted on reflective tape on Rosie's bicycle, had been careless enough to fall off a catwalk. It didn't make sense. It had never made sense. But grief has a way of drowning out logic. In the weeks and months following the funeral, Elaine had been so consumed by the sheer act of survival that the nagging questions about Garrett's death had been pushed to the deepest corners of her mind, buried beneath the avalanche of bills and collection notices and late-night panic attacks. Garrett's life insurance, which should have been enough to keep them afloat for years, had been contested and ultimately denied by the insurance company. The claim was that Garrett's death was a result of his own gross negligence, which voided the policy. The medical bills from his agonizing final hours in the intensive care unit had drained their modest savings within weeks. The mortgage payments stopped. The utilities were cut. The bank foreclosed on their little house on Elm Street. And then, like a vulture circling a dying animal, Vernon Pratt had arrived. Pratt was a loan shark who operated in the shadows of Odessa, feeding on the desperate and the broken. He had appeared at Elaine's door 1 month after the funeral, dressed in a cheap suit that smelled of strong cologne and stale cigarettes. He had a ledger, a meticulously forged document that showed Garrett had borrowed $5,000 from him 6 months before his death. With interest, Pratt explained with a smile that never reached his eyes the total was now closer to 8. Elaine had known it was a lie. Garrett never borrowed money from anyone. But she was broken. She was drowning. She had a 7-year-old daughter who needed food and shelter, and she had no fight left in her. She had begged for time, and Pratt had given it to her in small, cruel increments, each extension accompanied by thinly veiled threats that grew less veiled with every passing month. Now sitting in the Rusty Spoon with exactly $14.32 to her name, Elaine had reached the end of the rope. The eviction notice from the Starlight Motel where they had been living in a room that smelled of cheap bleach and old cigarettes was folded in her purse. She had received a text message from Pratt that morning. 3 words that had turned her blood to ice. Time is up. Mommy, can I have fries? Rosie's voice cut through the dark fog in Elaine's mind like a beam of unexpected sunlight. She looked at her daughter, at those enormous blue eyes that still held a child's boundless, undefeated trust in the goodness of the world, and she felt her heart crack along the fault lines that had been forming for 2 years. Not today, sweet bug. Elaine managed, forcing a smile that felt like lifting a boulder. We're just having a quick stop before we go back home. Drink your water. Rosie nodded agreeably and returned to her coloring, apparently unfazed. Children have a remarkable ability to accept the present moment without questioning it, a gift that adults lose somewhere along the way and spend the rest of their lives mourning. Outside, the quiet hum of the desert was violently shattered. A deafening roar rolled across the parking lot, a thunderous guttural sound that vibrated through the thin walls of the diner and rattled the coffee mugs on their saucers. The floorboards trembled. The windows buzzed in their frames. Elaine's head snapped toward the front of the restaurant, her body instinctively going rigid with the animal alertness of a mother sensing a threat. Through the plate glass window, she watched as a pack of heavily modified motorcycles pulled into the dusty parking lot. They came in a staggered formation, the riders moving with a coordinated precision that spoke of years of riding together. The machines were massive, custom-built, their chrome catching the brutal sunlight and throwing it back in blinding flashes. 6 men dismounted. They were enormous, heavily tattooed, and wearing the unmistakable leather vests of the Hells Angels. The patches on their backs, the infamous winged death's head, were visible even from inside the diner. These were not weekend hobbyists playing dress-up. These were the real thing. Men who had earned every stitch on their cuts through acts that polite society preferred not to think about. Elaine instinctively pulled Rosie closer, her arm wrapping around her daughter's small shoulders with a protective tightness that bordered on painful. At the center of the pack, dismounting last, was a man who looked like he had been carved directly from the same unforgiving bedrock that formed the West Texas landscape. Marcus Thornton, known on the streets and in the darkest corridors of the criminal underworld, simply as brick, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. His shoulders were impossibly broad, stretching the seams of his faded leather vest. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down through his bearded jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in a Juarez bar that had left the other man in a permanent vegetative state. His eyes were a cold, calculating steel gray, the color of a winter sky that promises nothing but a hard frost. Brick was 47 years old. He had spent 11 of those years in federal prison, another 20 riding with the club, and the remaining years trying to forget a grief so profound that it had hollowed him out from the inside, leaving nothing but a shell of muscle and scar tissue and barely controlled rage. As the bikers swaggered into the diner, the atmosphere instantly shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Waitresses suddenly found themselves urgently occupied with wiping down counters in the farthest corners of the room. The cook in the back kitchen peered through the serving window, his face the color of old paste. Brick and his crew took up a large booth in the center of the dining room, their massive frames spilling over the edges of the vinyl seats. Their loud voices and coarse laughter dominated the space with the effortless authority of men who had long ago stopped caring what anyone thought of them. Colton Byrne, known as Ratchet, sat to Brick's right. He was Brick's right-hand man, a lanky, sharp-eyed mechanic with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and a spiderweb tattoo creeping up his neck. On Brick's left sat a mountain of a man called Sledge, whose knuckles were so scarred they looked like cracked riverbeds, and whose silence was more unsettling than any threat he could have spoken. Rosie, however, did not see the danger. She didn't understand the patches or the prison tattoos or the heavy, barely concealed weapons. As she peered over the edge of their booth, her small chin resting on the cracked vinyl, her eyes focused on the man in the center, she saw the frayed edges of his leather vest, the worn-out boots with their scuffed toes, and the grim, hardened look on his scarred face. In her innocent mind, a mental equation formed with the simple, devastating clarity that only a child can produce. Patched clothes plus a sad face equaled one thing. He was poor, just like them. "Mommy, I need to go to the bathroom," Rosie whispered, sliding down from the booth. "Okay, baby, go straight there and come right back." Elaine said, her eyes fixed nervously on the table of bikers, silently praying they would not notice the small girl slipping past them. Rosie slid out of the booth, her worn sneakers making barely a sound on the linoleum floor. But she did not head toward the restrooms. Instead, she slipped her small hand into the pocket of her denim overalls. Her fingers brushed against the crisp dollar bill she had been saving for 3 weeks. It was a gift from the tooth fairy placed carefully under her pillow by her mother, who had gone without lunch for 2 days to afford even that small magic. Rosie had planned to buy a candy bar at the gas station. She had been thinking about it for days, the specific candy bar, the one with the caramel and the nougat, the one that cost exactly 99 cents plus tax. But as she looked at the giant man with the torn jacket and the saddest eyes she had ever seen on a grown-up, a profound, unshakable sense of duty settled over her small shoulders. He needed it more than she did. Quietly, with the stealth of a child who had learned to move silently through motel hallways so as not to disturb sleeping neighbors, Rosie pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner and stepped out into the blistering heat. The parking lot was a furnace. The asphalt radiated waves of shimmering heat that made the air itself seem to vibrate and bend. The motorcycles sat in a row, ticking softly as their massive engines cooled. They were enormous machines, gleaming and dangerous, each one worth more than everything Elaine owned in the world combined. Rosie walked up to the largest one, a custom black Harley-Davidson Street Glide, with heavy saddlebags and chrome exhaust pipes thick as her arm. It was Brick's bike. She pulled a small roll of clear tape from her pocket. She always carried it for her arts and crafts projects, a habit that Elaine found endlessly endearing and occasionally frustrating when tape ended up on the bathroom mirror or the television screen. From her other pocket, she retrieved a tiny scrap of paper torn from a diner napkin on which she had scrawled a message earlier in waxy purple crayon. With her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in deep concentration, Rosie carefully taped the single-dollar bill on the worn leather seat of the terrifying machine. She placed the little note right on top of George Washington's face, smoothing it down with her small palm to make sure it would stick. The note read in the clumsy, oversized letters of a child still learning to write, "To buy a new jacket. Please don't be sad." She patted the seat, once smiled with the pure, radiant satisfaction of a person who has done a good deed, and scurried back inside the diner. She washed her hands in the bathroom because her mother always told her to wash her hands and then return to the booth. "Everything okay?" Elaine asked, noticing a strange, proud gleam in her daughter's eyes that hadn't been there before. "Everything is perfect, Mommy." Rosie beamed, climbing back onto the vinyl seat and picking up her purple crayon. "I helped somebody today." Elaine studied her daughter's face for a moment, a faint, puzzled smile touching her lips. Then the weight of her own problems crashed back down, and she returned to staring at the cold coffee and the bleak arithmetic of her collapsing life. Inside the diner, Brick pushed his half-eaten steak away, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. The mood at the bikers' table was tense beneath the surface of their loud bravado. They were in the middle of a delicate territorial dispute with a rival operation out of El Paso, and Brick's mind was heavy with the logistics of an impending confrontation that could easily turn bloody. He signaled the waitress, a nervous older woman named Doris, whose hands shook slightly as she approached the table of leather-clad giants. Brick dropped a crisp $100 bill on the table. "Keep the change, darling." "Thank you, sir," Doris stammered, scooping up the money with the speed of a woman who wanted to minimize her time in the blast radius. "Let's ride," Brick commanded. His brothers stood in unison, a synchronized machine of leather and muscle, and filed out of the diner. The blinding midday sun forced them to squint as they stepped into the parking lot. Conversations inside the diner slowly, tentatively began to resume. Brick approached his bike, reaching into his pocket for his keys. His fingers found the familiar shape of the heavy fob, and he was already mentally mapping the route to their next meeting when he stopped, dead in his tracks. The rest of the crew froze. When Brick stopped, everyone stopped. It was an unspoken law of their world, as absolute and non-negotiable as gravity. Ratchet's hands subtly dropped toward the heavy wrench he kept in his belt, the weapon that had earned him his name. Sledge's massive shoulders squared, his eyes scanning the empty lot for any sign of a threat. "We got a problem, boss," Ratchet murmured, his voice barely audible. Brick didn't answer. He was staring at the leather seat of his Harley. To touch a Hells Angels motorcycle without permission was a severe offense in their world, a transgression that was answered with immediate brutal violence. It was a sign of ultimate disrespect, a challenge that could not and would not go unanswered. The last person who had so much as leaned against Brick's bike had spent 6 weeks eating through a straw. Brick's blood boiled as he saw a piece of clear plastic tape stuck directly to his custom leather upholstery. His massive hands balled into fists, the tendons standing out like steel cables beneath his tattooed skin. He stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his scarred face rippled. He was preparing to rip the offending object off and hunt down whoever had dared to deface his property. But as he leaned over the seat, the anger drained from his body with a sudden, violent completeness that left him feeling physically hollowed out. Taped to the seat was a crisp $1 bill. Beneath the tape, pressed against the face of George Washington, was a small torn piece of a diner napkin. Written on it in waxy purple crayon were the clumsy, oversized letters of a child learning to write. "To buy a new jacket, please don't be sad." Brick stopped breathing. The desert wind seemed to fade into absolute silence. The distant hum of Highway 385, the ticking of cooling engines, The muffled sounds of the diner behind him, everything fell away. The entire world contracted to the size of that small, wrinkled piece of napkin and the earnest, misspelled words written upon it in purple crayon. And suddenly Brick was no longer standing in a sweltering parking lot in Odessa, Texas. He was standing in a sterile hospital room 8 years in the past. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a cold, institutional indifference. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else, something sweeter and more terrible, the smell of a body that was slowly giving up its hold on life. He was holding the tiny, lifeless hand of his own daughter, Nora. Nora, who had been 5 years old and who had fought leukemia with a ferocity that put grown men to shame. Nora, who had lost her hair and her color, and eventually her ability to walk, but who had never not once lost her smile. Nora, who used to write him little notes in purple crayon, her favorite color, and hide them in his boots before he went on runs with the club. Which that said things like, "Be safe, Daddy," and "I love you to the moon and the sun and back again." Nora, whose leukemia had drained the life from her small body before she even reached her 6th birthday. After she died, something fundamental had broken inside Marcus Thornton. The man he had been, the man who had dreams and hopes and the capacity for tenderness, had died on that hospital bed alongside his daughter. What remained was Brick, a weapon, a blunt instrument of violence and retribution. He had thrown himself completely into the brutal, numbing brotherhood of the club, desperate to feel anything other than the crushing, bottomless agony of his failure to protect his little girl. For 8 years it had worked. The violence, the adrenaline, the rigid structure of club hierarchy, and the unquestioning loyalty of his brothers had filled the void just enough to keep him functional. He had risen through the ranks on a tide of blood and ruthless efficiency, becoming the most feared enforcer in 3 states. He had buried the grief so deep that most days he could pretend it didn't exist. And now a 7-year-old girl with a purple crayon had reached into that grave and pulled it back into the light with a single devastating act of kindness. Brick slowly peeled the tape off the seat, his large, callous fingers trembling in a way that no amount of violence or danger had ever caused. He held the dollar bill and the note in his palm as though he were holding a fragile, infinitely precious artifact. Brick Ratchet's voice came from somewhere behind him, laced with confusion and the beginning of genuine alarm. He had never in 15 years of riding with this man seen him freeze like this. "What is it, a threat?" "No," Brick said, and his voice was different. The cold, commanding tone that his brothers knew and feared was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, something that sounded almost human. He carefully folded the dollar and the note, and with a deliberateness that bordered on reverence, he placed them into the breast pocket of his leather vest directly over his heart. He turned around. His steel-gray eyes locked onto the large plate glass window of the diner. Through it, he could see the blurred shapes of the patrons inside, and somewhere among them, the small girl with the purple crayon. Brick marched back toward the entrance, moving with a terrifying singular purpose that made his brothers instinctively fall into formation behind him. Ratchet and Sledge exchanged a look of pure bewilderment, but followed without question. When Brick moved, you moved with him. That was the law. Brick burst through the glass doors. The diner patrons who had just begun to relax and resume their meals instantly stiffened again. Forks clattered. A child in a far booth began to cry. Brick ignored them all. He walked directly to the counter where Doris was trying very hard to become invisible behind the coffee machine. "Who was it?" Brick demanded, his voice low, but carrying a frequency that commanded absolute immediate obedience. Doris trembled, nearly dropping a coffee pot into the steel sink. "I don't want any trouble, mister. Please, we're just a diner." "I'm not bringing trouble," Brick said. He was trying to soften his terrifying demeanor, but a man who has spent 20 years cultivating an aura of lethal menace cannot simply turn it off like a faucet. The effort was visible and largely unsuccessful. He pointed a massive finger toward the window in the parking lot beyond. A little girl, blonde hair. She was in here just a minute ago. Who is she? Doris swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the booth that Elaine and Rosie had just vacated. The table was empty now. 2 glasses, 1 coffee, and 1 water sat abandoned on the scarred Formica surface. That was Elaine. Elaine Mercer and her little girl Rosie. They left out the back door right after you boys walked out the front. Where do they live? Doris hesitated, a flicker of protective instinct, battling against her terror of the scarred giant looming over her counter. Look, Mr. Elaine has had a rough go of it. Her husband died a while back. She's a good mother. She really is. They're just struggling. Please don't hurt them. Brick leaned over the counter. His eyes burned with an intense, unreadable emotion that Doris could not categorize. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something deeper. Something that frightened her more than anger would have. Nobody is going to hurt them, Brick said, and the words came out with a weight that sounded less like a promise and more like a vow. Tell me about the struggling. Doris looked into those steel gray eyes and saw buried beneath decades of violence and hard living, something she never expected to find in the face of a Hell's Angels enforcer. She saw anguish, raw, unprocessed, agonizing anguish. She talked. She works nights at the laundry down on 4th Street, but it barely covers anything. She owes money, bad money, to Vernon Pratt. Doris's voice dropped to a whisper as though even speaking the name might summon the man. I heard her crying on the phone in the back alley last week. Pratt is threatening to take what she owes out of her hide. Or worse, they live over at the Starlight Motel Room 114. That's all I know. Just please leave them be. The name Vernon Pratt sent a dark ripple through Brick's mind. Pratt was a bottom-feeding parasite, a man who preyed exclusively on the desperate and the vulnerable. He wasn't affiliated with any club or organization. He was an independent predator known throughout the seedier corners of West Texas for his particular cruelty toward women who couldn't pay their debts. Brick straightened up. He didn't say another word to Doris. He turned on his heel and strode out of the diner, the glass door swinging shut behind him with a rattle. Ratchet, Brick barked as he threw his leg over the Harley, the massive machine, dipping slightly under his weight. Yeah, boss. We're taking a detour, the Starlight Motel. Ratchet frowned, checking his watch. We gotta sit down with the El Paso crew in an hour, Brick. We don't have time for a detour. If we're late, they'll take it as a sign of disrespect, and we'll have a war on our hands before sundown. Brick fired up his engine, the massive twin cylinders roaring to life with a sound that shook the earth. He looked Ratchet dead in the eye, and Ratchet saw something he hadn't seen in Brick for nearly a decade. Humanity, mixed with an absolutely terrifying protective rage that made the hair on the back of Ratchet's neck stand straight up. The El Paso crew can wait, Brick growled over the thunder of the exhaust. I have a debt to repay. The Starlight Motel was a rotting husk of a building on the eastern edge of town, the kind of place that existed in the no man's land between poverty and homelessness. Its neon sign buzzed ominously in the daylight, missing so many letters that it read only SARIHT. The parking lot was a cracked expanse of sun-bleached asphalt populated by a handful of vehicles in various stages of mechanical death. Inside room 114, the air was thick and stale, carrying the permanent smell of cheap bleach and decades of cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning would ever fully remove. The walls were thin. The carpet was a color that might once have been beige, but had long since surrendered to an indeterminate gray-brown. A single window, its glass clouded with age, let in a pale, defeated light. Elaine was frantically packing a battered canvas duffel bag. Her movements were jerky, desperate, the movements of a woman operating on pure adrenaline and maternal terror. She threw Rosie's clothes into the bag, a few worn stuffed animals, whatever non-perishable food they had, a half-empty box of crackers, 2 granola bars, a can of beans. "Are we going on a trip, Mommy?" Rosie asked, sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress and watching her mother's frantic activity with a mixture of excitement and confusion. "Yes, baby, a surprise trip." Elaine lied, her voice shaking despite her desperate effort to keep it steady. Tears streamed silently down her face, but she kept her back turned so Rosie wouldn't see. She had received the text message 12 minutes ago, and the words were seared into her brain. "Time's up, Elaine. I'm coming to collect. If you don't have my 5 grand, I'm taking it out in trade. See you in 5." Elaine knew exactly what in trade meant. The implication had been made explicit in their last face-to-face encounter when Pratt had run a finger along her jawline and told her she had assets that were worth more than cash. She had been violently ill afterward, vomiting into the motel toilet while Rosie slept oblivious in the next bed. She zipped the duffel bag shut, her knuckles white. The plan was simple and desperate. Get to the ancient Honda Civic in the parking lot. Get on the highway. Drive west until the gas ran out or they reached her sister's place in New Mexico. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. "Grab your backpack, Rosie. We have to go right now," Elaine said, reaching for the door handle with one hand and clutching her car keys in the other. Before her fingers touched the knob, a heavy fist pounded against the cheap wood from the outside, shaking the entire doorframe. The sound was obscenely loud in the small room, like a gunshot. Elaine froze. Her hand hung in the air inches from the knob. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she was certain it would break through. "Open up, Elaine." A slick, menacing voice called from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there. I can hear you breathing. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Mommy," Rosie whispered, her blue eyes suddenly enormous. The coloring book forgotten. Elaine spun around, dropping to her knees in front of her daughter. She grabbed Rosie's small shoulders and looked directly into her eyes, pouring every ounce of calm she did not feel into her voice. "Go to the bathroom, baby. Lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you. No matter what you hear, promise me." Rosie, sensing her mother's sheer terror with the preternatural intuition that children possess, obeyed without a single word of argument. She slipped off the bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest, and padded quickly to the small, dingy bathroom at the back of the room. The lock clicked shut with a sound that was simultaneously reassuring and heartbreaking. The motel room door bowed inward as a heavy shoulder slammed against it from the outside. The cheap deadbolt held for one impact. 2. On the third, the doorframe splintered with a crack like a breaking bone, and the door swung violently open, slamming against the wall and sending a cascade of paint chips onto the stained carpet. Vernon Pratt stepped into the room. He was a wiry man, all sinew and sharp edges, dressed in a cheap navy suit that he wore with the misplaced confidence of a man who believed expensive clothes could make him something he wasn't. His dark hair was slicked back with an excess of product, and his cologne preceded him into the room like an advance guard, cloying and aggressive. Behind him stood 2 men, thick-necked and slack-jawed, the kind of men who rented out their size and their willingness to hurt people for modest sums of cash. Pratt smiled. It was a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever, the smile of a predator that has cornered its prey and is savoring the moment before the strike. "Going somewhere, Elaine?" Pratt asked, stepping over the threshold and kicking the broken door shut behind him. His dark eyes swept over the packed duffel bag on the bed. Without saying goodbye. Now that hurts my feelings. Pratt, please. Elaine backed away until her spine hit the far wall. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. I don't have the money. I tried. I'll get it. I swear, I just need another week. A week? Pratt laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound devoid of any genuine amusement. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew there was nowhere for his prey to run. You've been saying 1 more week for 6 months, sweetheart. Your deadbeat husband borrowed my money and now it's your problem. He reached out and grabbed a fistful of her hair. Elaine gasped in pain as he yanked her head back, forcing her to look into his dark, empty eyes. Since you can't pay with peace, Pratt said, running a sleazy hand down her cheek, you're going to pay me another way. We discussed this. Boys, secure the room. No, please. Elaine's voice broke. My daughter is in there. Please, Pratt. Not in front of my daughter. Pratt's eyes flicked toward the bathroom door. Something dark and amused passed across his face. Even better. Keeps you motivated to do exactly what I say. He raised his hand to strike her. Elaine squeezed her eyes shut. She braced herself for the impact, her body tensing, her mind retreating to a place deep inside where she could be with Rosie, where none of this was real. She thought about Garrett. She thought about the promises she had made at their wedding, the promises she had made at his grave. The blow never came. Instead, the entire building began to vibrate. A low, thunderous rumble rolled through the walls of the motel, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. The cheap window panes rattled in their frames. The water glass on the nightstand danced across the surface and crashed to the floor. It felt like the earth itself was opening up beneath them. Pratt paused, his hand still raised, his head turning slowly toward the window. His two thugs exchanged a nervous glance. Outside, a convoy of black Harley-Davidsons roared into the narrow motel courtyard, their engines screaming in unison before cutting off simultaneously. The sudden silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of men who had stopped talking because talking was over. Heavy steel-toed boots crunched on the gravel outside. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. The broken door to room 114 was kicked completely off its remaining hinge, sending it crashing onto the carpet in a cloud of dust and splinters. Brick filled the doorway. He stood in the opening like a monument, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun so completely that the room actually darkened. The jagged scar on his face was a white line against his tanned, weathered skin. His steel-gray eyes swept the room in a single comprehensive scan that took in everything: Pratt's hand in Elaine's hair, the two thugs flanking the bed, the locked bathroom door, the packed duffel bag. Behind Brick, Ratchet, and 4 other Hell's Angels stood like silent statues carved from stone and leather. Their faces were expressionless. Their hands rested near their weapons with the practiced ease of men for whom violence was a professional skill. Pratt dropped his hand from Elaine's hair. His arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by a pale, sweating fear that he could not mask despite his desperate effort to maintain composure. He recognized the cuts. He recognized the scar. Everyone in Odessa knew who Brick was. Everyone. Thornton, Pratt stammered, raising both hands in a placating gesture. Look, man, this is a private business matter. I don't have any beef with the club. This is between me and the widow here. She owes me money. Brick stepped into the room. He did not look at Pratt. He did not look at the two thugs who were already backing themselves into the corner farthest from the door, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the heavily armed bikers blocking their only exit. Brick's eyes found Elaine. She was pressed against the wall, trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. A red mark bloomed on her cheek where Pratt's grip had left its imprint. But her eyes, when they met Brick's, were not the eyes of a woman who had given up. They were the eyes of a mother, fierce and desperate and burning with a rage that had no outlet. "You're Elaine," Brick asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Elaine nodded. She couldn't speak. The terror and the confusion and the faint, irrational spark of hope were all battling for control of her vocal cords. Brick turned his head slowly toward Pratt. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, and that casualness was infinitely more frightening than speed would have been. "You're Vernon Pratt." "Yeah, but like I said, Thornton, this is between me and—" Brick moved. He moved with a speed that defied his massive size, a speed that caught even Ratchet off guard. Before Pratt could finish his sentence, Brick's hand shot out and closed around the loan shark's throat. His fingers, thick as industrial bolts, locked around Pratt's windpipe with a grip that had the mechanical, implacable quality of a hydraulic press. With a sickening display of raw, effortless power, Brick lifted Vernon Pratt completely off the floor. Pratt's legs kicked wildly in the air, his polished shoes swinging like a hangman's pendulum. His face cycled rapidly through shades of red to purple. His hands clawed uselessly at Brick's immovable forearm, his manicured nails scraping against tattooed skin without leaving so much as a mark. The two thugs made a brief, half-hearted motion to intervene. Ratchet pulled a heavy, snub-nosed revolver from inside his vest and pointed it at them with the lazy indifference of a man swatting a fly. The thugs froze their hands, shooting skyward. "You like terrorizing women, Pratt," Brick whispered. His face was inches from the choking loan shark, close enough that Pratt could see the individual lines of the scar. Each stitch marked a testament to the violence this man had survived and inflicted. "You like breaking into rooms where little girls are hiding. Does that make you feel powerful?" Pratt couldn't answer. He was making a strangled, wet sound that might have been an attempt at words, but came out as nothing more than a desperate gurgle. "How much does she owe you?" Pratt and Brick demanded. "$50," Pratt wheezed, his eyes bulging. "Of grand." Brick held him there for 3 more seconds, not because he needed to, because he wanted Pratt to understand with absolute clarity how close he was to dying. Then he tossed the loan shark aside like a piece of garbage. Pratt crashed into the dresser, splintering the cheap particle board, and collapsed onto the floor in a heap, gasping and clutching his bruised throat. His expensive cologne mixed with the smell of cheap wood and fear. Brick reached into his leather vest. He didn't pull out a gun or a knife. He pulled out a thick wad of cash held together with a rubber band. He peeled off 50 $100 bills with the casual efficiency of a man counting out change and threw them onto Pratt's chest. "There's your 5 grand, Brick said, his voice deadly quiet. "Her debt is paid. This transaction is concluded. And now I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully because I am only going to say it once." He crouched down beside the gasping loan shark, bringing his scarred face close. "If you ever look at her again, if you ever breathe the same air as her or her daughter, if you ever so much as drive down the same street as them, I will find you. And I won't just kill you, Pratt. I will take my time doing it. I will make it last for days. And when your body is finally found in a ditch outside of Pecos, the coroner won't be able to identify you with dental records because you won't have any teeth left. Do you understand me?" Pratt, his eyes streaming with tears of pain and terror, nodded frantically. "Get out." Pratt scrambled to his feet, stuffing the cash into his jacket with shaking hands. His thugs were already through the doorway, stumbling over each other in their desperation to reach the parking lot. The 3 men fled to their black SUV, and the vehicle peeled out of the Starlight Motel parking lot in a spray of gravel and a cloud of blue exhaust. Silence returned to the small, destroyed room. The only sounds were the distant hum of the air conditioning unit next door and Elaine's ragged, uneven breathing. She stared at the giant biker who filled her room, this terrifying stranger who had just paid off the debt that had been slowly strangling the life out of her, and she could not make sense of any of it. Her legs were shaking so badly she had to lean against the wall for support. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why did you do that? Brick turned to her. The murderous intensity that had transformed his face moments earlier softened just a fraction, like a crack in a glacier that allows a thin beam of light to pass through. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he called out toward the bathroom door, and when he spoke, his gravelly voice carried a gentleness that seemed physically impossible coming from a man of his size and bearing. You can come out now, little one. The lock clicked. The cheap bathroom door creaked opened on its rusted hinges, and Rosie peeked out. Her blue eyes were wide but remarkably dry. She was clutching her stuffed rabbit with one arm and a roll of toilet paper with the other, apparently having decided during her confinement that toilet paper was a useful thing to have in an emergency. Her eyes landed on Brick, and instead of the terror that would have been entirely appropriate, her face broke into a wide, delighted grin of recognition. "It's the poor man," Rosie exclaimed, slipping past her mother's desperate grab and running across the room with the fearless, headlong abandon of a child who has decided that a person is good and therefore safe. She stopped directly in front of Brick and looked up at him, her head tilted back at a sharp angle to take in the full height of him. "Did you buy a new jacket with my dollar?" she asked, her voice bright with genuine, hopeful curiosity. Brick dropped to one knee. The giant, terrifying enforcer of the Hells Angels lowered himself onto the filthy motel carpet, his bad knee protesting with a crack that echoed in the quiet room, so that he could be eye level with the 7-year-old girl who had, without knowing it, without understanding the faintest implication of what she had done, reached through decades of armor and scar tissue and found the last living nerve in a dead man's heart. He reached into his breast pocket and gently pulled out the carefully folded $1 bill and the torn napkin with the purple crayon writing. He held them in his open palm, and his hand, the hand that had just lifted a grown man off the ground by his throat, trembled. "No, Rosie," Brick said, and his voice cracked. The deep, commanding rumble fractured along a fault line he hadn't known was there, and for a terrifying, beautiful moment the man beneath the monster was completely visible. His steel-gray eyes glistened, the moisture catching the pale light from the window. "I didn't buy a new jacket, but you gave me something much more valuable. You reminded me that I still have a heart left to beat." Rosie tilted her head, considering this. "That's good," she said with the devastating simplicity of a child. "Because hearts are important. My daddy's heart stopped working, and now he lives in the sky." Brick closed his eyes. The pain that washed across his scarred face was so raw, so profoundly exposed, that Elaine had to look away. It felt indecent to witness, like stumbling upon a stranger's most private, unguarded moment of grief. When Brick opened his eyes, they were clear. Something had shifted behind them. Some internal decision had been made, some line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. He stood up, tucking the dollar and the note carefully back into his breast pocket, and turned to Elaine. "Get your bag. Both of you are coming with me." Elaine's protective instinct flared. "I appreciate what you did, more than I can say. But I don't know you. I am not taking my daughter to a motorcycle club." Brick regarded her steadily. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He simply stated facts. "Pratt will be back. Not today. Maybe not this week. But men like him don't stay scared. He'll come back with more muscle, and next time I might not be here. You've got $14 a car that's leaking transmission fluid in the parking lot and no family within 500 miles. You can lock that motel door behind me and hope for the best, or you can come with me where the doors are reinforced steel and there are 40 men with guns between your daughter and anyone who wants to hurt her. He paused, letting the reality settle over her. There's a private room with a deadbolt that locks from the inside. You keep the key. Nobody enters without your permission, not even me. Elaine looked at her daughter. Rosie was looking up at Brick with an expression of complete, unwavering trust, the kind of trust that children reserve for the people they have decided belong in their world. Elaine looked back at Brick. She thought about Pratt. She thought about the text message. She thought about the 500 miles of empty highway between Odessa and her sister's house in New Mexico and the ancient Honda Civic with the leaking transmission and the $14. She picked up the duffel bag. If anything happens to my daughter, Elaine said, her voice low and steady and burning with a quiet ferocity that made Brick's eyebrows rise just slightly, I will kill you myself, club or no club. Brick held her gaze, and for the first time in what felt like years, something that was almost but not quite a smile touched the corner of his scarred mouth. Fair enough. The ride to the Hells Angels compound was a blur of deafening exhaust and whipping desert wind. Elaine sat in the passenger seat of Ratchet's armored Chevy Tahoe, clutching Rosie tightly in her lap. The vehicle was sandwiched in the center of a protective diamond formation, Brick riding point sledge, and two others flanking the sides, a prospect bringing up the rear. Elaine's mind was in freefall. Less than an hour ago, she had been moments away from becoming the property of a sadistic predator. Now she was under the armed escort of the most notorious motorcycle club in Texas, heading to their heavily fortified compound with her 7-year-old daughter. She looked out the tinted window at Brick, who was riding point, his massive frame absorbing the vibrations of his Harley with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life on a motorcycle than off one. His leather vest flapped in the wind, and the dollar bill from her daughter was tucked against his chest, pressed against whatever was left of his heart. Am I trading one monster for a dozen others? Elaine thought, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. Or did my 7-year-old just do what no law enforcement agency, no social worker, no crisis hotline ever managed to do? Did she find us someone who actually gives a damn? They turned off the main highway onto a fractured asphalt road that wound deep into the industrial outskirts of Odessa. The landscape grew harsher, more desolate. Abandoned warehouses and rusting storage tanks lined the road like the bones of a dead civilization. The compound loomed ahead, a sprawling, fortress-like salvage yard surrounded by 12-foot-high corrugated steel walls, topped with coils of razor wire that gleamed wickedly in the afternoon sun. Two heavy iron gates operated by a prospect holding a pump-action shotgun swung open as the convoy approached. The Tahoe rolled into the yard and Elaine's breath hitched. The interior of the compound was a world unto itself. Dozens of men, heavily tattooed and leather-clad, stopped what they were doing to stare at the unfamiliar vehicle. Choppers in various stages of assembly and repair filled the open-air garages. Heavy metal music blared from a set of speakers, and the air was sharp with the smell of gasoline, stale beer, and exhaust. "Mommy, is this a castle?" Rosie whispered, her eyes wide with awe as she pressed her small nose against the window. "It's a kind of castle, sweet bug," Elaine replied, her voice barely steady. Ratchet parked the Tahoe and came around to open her door. His face, grease-smudged and sharp, was surprisingly gentle as he offered her his hand. "Come on, ma'am. Boss wants you inside. You're safe here. Nobody breaches the wire." Brick was already waiting by the heavy steel doors of the main clubhouse. He led them through a dimly lit common area that reeked of leather and cigarette smoke, past a massive mahogany bar, and down a narrow cinder block hallway to a private back room. It was small but clean, a sturdy door with a heavy deadbolt, a modest bed with sheets that smelled of laundry detergent, a small television, a bathroom with functioning plumbing and actual hot water. It's not the Ritz, Brick said, handing Elaine a brass key, but the sheets are clean and the lock works. You and the little one stay here until we figure this out. Figure what out? Elaine asked, wrapping her arms around herself. You paid Pratt. You saved us. I don't know how I'll ever repay you, Mr. Thornton, but we should just leave town. I have a sister in New Mexico. Brick crossed his massive arms. The jagged scar caught the dim overhead light. Pratt is a bottom feeder. He doesn't operate in a vacuum. He doesn't usually hunt down widows for $5,000 unless someone pays him to make a point. Brick's steel gray eyes narrowed. You said your husband owed him, but Doris told me your husband was straight-laced, a safety inspector. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Elaine felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Did your husband ever mention the name Blackwood? The blood drained from Elaine's face. The room tilted. Blackwood. The word hit her like a physical blow, not because she recognized it from any document or conversation, but because she had heard it in the darkest, most vulnerable hours of her grief. In those final weeks before his death, Garrett had been different, restless, paranoid. He checked the locks twice. He started parking his truck in the garage instead of the driveway. He slept poorly, and when he did sleep, he talked. Fragments, disconnected words mumbled into the pillow in the dead of night. And one of those words repeated more than once had been Blackwood. How do you know that name? Elaine whispered. Brick studied her face for a long moment, reading the shock and the confusion, and beneath it all, the dawning spark of a terrible suspicion that had been buried under 2 years of grief and survival. I don't know it yet, Brick said, but I'm going to. Ratchet, he called over his shoulder. Ratchet appeared instantly in the doorway. Run everything you can on Apex Petrochemical. Specifically, I want the name behind a shell corporation called Blackwood Holdings. I want to know who denied Garrett Mercer's life insurance claim. And I want to know if there's a paper trail connecting Apex to Vernon Pratt. You think the refinery is connected to the loan shark boss? Ratchet asked, his brow furrowing. I think, Brick growled, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in Elaine's chest. That coincidence is a fairy tale for fools, and I don't believe in fairy tales. He looked back at Elaine, and in his eyes she saw something that she had not seen directed at her from anyone in 2 long agonizing years. She saw commitment, not pity, not charity, commitment. You rest, eat. I'll have one of the prospects bring you hot food. Tomorrow we get to the bottom of this. Brick turned to leave. A tiny hand grabbed his thick leather belt. He froze, looked down. Rosie was standing beside him, holding out a single playing card she had found on the nightstand, the King of Hearts. Thank you for saving us, Brick, she chirped, her blue eyes shining. You're not poor at all. You're the richest person I know. Brick stared at the little girl. The ghost of his own daughter flickered behind his eyes there, and gone a flash of blonde hair and purple crayon, and a laugh that he would never hear again. He gently took the card from her tiny fingers. You're welcome, little bird, he said softly. Nobody is going to hurt you, I promise. He walked out of the room, and the heavy door closed behind him with a solid, reassuring thud. Elaine turned the deadbolt. The mechanism engaged with a satisfying click. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling Rosie into her lap. For the first time in 2 years, she was behind a locked door that she controlled. For the first time in 2 years, there were walls between her daughter and the predators of the world that were made of something stronger than her own exhausted, battered body. She pressed her face into Rosie's hair and wept. Not the terrified, stifled crying she had done in motel rooms. These were heavy, shuddering sobs of something she barely recognized. Relief. For the next 48 hours, the compound transformed into something surreal. Hardened criminals, men who had spent time in federal penitentiaries, went out of their way to avoid cursing near Rosie. Sledge, the mountain of a man whose fists had ended more fights than anyone cared to count, spent 2 hours sitting cross-legged on the dusty concrete floor, while Rosie braided his long, wild hair into elaborate, lopsided plaids decorated with paper clips and rubber bands. Hawk, the club's armorer, a quiet man with cold eyes and steady hands, somehow produced a pink coloring book and a brand new set of crayons, presenting them to Rosie with an awkward, toothy grin that looked entirely unpracticed. But while Rosie found a bizarre, heavily tattooed family, Brick and Ratchet were digging into a nightmare. Late on the second evening, Brick summoned Elaine to the church, the soundproofed room with the massive oak table where the club held its official business. Brick sat at the head, flanked by Ratchet and Sledge. A thick manila folder sat on the polished wood. The air in the room was heavy, charged with the weight of impending revelation. "Sit down, Elaine Tickstrom," Brick said gently, gesturing to a leather chair. She sat. Her hands gripped the armrests. She knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who has been living inside a lie for 2 years that whatever was in that folder was going to change everything. Ratchet slid the folder across the table. "Boss was right," Ratchet said, his voice grim. "Your husband's debt to Pratt was a complete fabrication. We got hold of Pratt's accountant and persuaded him to share some records." He tapped a printed bank statement. "The $5,000 Pratt claimed your husband owed was deposited into Pratt's offshore account 3 weeks after your husband died. Not before. After." Elaine's blood ran cold. Her vision narrowed. The room seemed to contract around her. "Deposited by who?" she heard herself ask. "A shell corporation called Blackwood Holdings," Ratchet explained, "which is a subsidiary of Apex Petrochemical. Specifically, it ties directly back to a man named Preston Whitmore, regional vice president of operations at the refinery." Brick leaned forward, folding his massive hands on the scarred oak. "Garrett didn't die in an accident, Elaine." The words hung in the air like smoke. "2 weeks before his death, your husband flagged a critical failure in the refinery's main pressure valves. Whitmore had been buying cheap counterfeit parts from overseas manufacturers and pocketing millions in the budget difference. If those valves fail, half the refinery goes up and thousands of people die. Your husband found the paper trail. He was going to blow the whistle." Elaine could not breathe. The steel band around her lungs, the one that had been slowly tightening for 2 years, suddenly crushed inward. "Whitmore had him killed," Brick said, each word landing like a hammer blow. "He rigged the accident on the catwalk. Then he ensured your insurance claim was denied to financially destroy you. He hired Pratt to forge a debt and terrorize you, hoping you'd either run away or break completely. He wanted you too devastated, too broken, to ever start looking into the circumstances of your husband's death." The room was silent. Ratchet and Sledge watched Elaine with the careful, wary attention of men who understood grief and its explosive potential. Elaine sat motionless for a long time. The tears came, but they were different from any tears she had shed before. They were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of rage, a white-hot, incandescent fury that started in her chest and spread outward through her body like wildfire through dry brush. Garrett, her quiet, careful, decent husband. The man who read bedtime stories and checked smoke detectors and kissed her forehead every morning before dawn. They had murdered him. They had thrown his body off a catwalk, branded him negligent, stolen his legacy, and then sent a predator after his widow to make sure the truth stayed buried. They killed my husband. Elaine's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a vibration that made the hardened men in the room shift uncomfortably. They tried to sell me to a monster. They nearly took my daughter's mother away. She looked up at Brick, and in her hazel eyes was something that Brick recognized instantly because he had seen it in his own mirror every day for 8 years. The birth of a reckoning. Garrett was paranoid in those last weeks. Elaine said, her jaw trembling, but set with a new iron resolve. He kept saying he needed an insurance policy, not the financial kind, a different kind. He hid something, a flash drive. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I needed to find it. Where is it? Brick demanded. Our old house on Elm Street, the one the bank foreclosed on after the insurance was denied. It's sitting empty. He hid it inside a false bottom he built into Rosie's wooden music box in the nursery. Brick looked at Ratchet. Some wordless communication passed between the two men, a language forged over years of shared violence and absolute trust. Gear up, Brick said, pushing back from the table. We leave in 10 minutes. We get that drive, we get the proof, and then we bring the execution. Elaine stood up. Her legs were unsteady. Her heart was hammering. But the fear that had governed her life for 2 years was gone, incinerated by a fury that burned hotter than the West Texas sun. She looked at Brick, and her voice came out steady and certain. I'm coming with you. Brick studied her for a long moment. He saw the steel in her eyes, the same steel he had seen when she had threatened to kill him if anything happened to her daughter. This was not a woman asking for permission. This was a woman telling him what was going to happen. You stay behind me, Brick said. You do exactly what I say when I say it. You do not deviate. Elaine nodded once. Let's go get my husband's voice back. The night air was thick and oppressive heavy, with the residual heat that the desert floor had been absorbing all day and was now slowly, reluctantly releasing back into the atmosphere. There was no breeze. The air hung motionless over Odessa like a wet wool blanket, trapping the heat close to the earth and making every breath feel like an act of labor. Ratchet's armored Chevy Tahoe, running with its headlights off, rolled to a silent stop 2 blocks away from the Montgomerys' former home on Elm Street. The suburban neighborhood was dead quiet at this hour, illuminated only by the flickering amber glow of widely spaced street lamps that cast more shadows than light. Sprinklers hissed softly on a neighboring lawn. A dog barked once far away and then fell silent. Brick stepped out of the vehicle first, his boots making barely a sound on the pavement. He had changed since leaving the compound. The leather vest was gone, replaced by a Kevlar vest worn beneath a dark, long-sleeved tactical shirt. A heavy .45 caliber 1911 pistol sat holstered at his hip, and he carried a suppressed tactical shotgun that he handled with the casual familiarity of a man holding a tool he had used many times before. Ratchet followed, then Sledge and Hawk. They moved with the controlled precision of men who had breached more doors and cleared more rooms than they could count. This was not their first night operation, and the ease with which they transitioned from barroom brawlers to a tactical unit spoke to the kind of military backgrounds that several club members carried but rarely discussed. Elaine climbed out last. She wore dark clothes borrowed from the compound, a black t-shirt and jeans that were too large for her thin frame, cinched at the waist, with a belt that had required a new hole punched with a screwdriver. Her auburn hair was pulled back tight. Her face was pale but composed, her jaw set with the determined rigidity of a woman who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. Elaine, you stay in the truck, Brick ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Elaine said. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply stated a fact. I know exactly which floorboard the music box is under. I'm not sitting in the dark while you tear apart my daughter's nursery looking for it. This is for Garrett. Brick studied her face in the dim light. He saw the hardened steel that had replaced her fear over the past 48 hours, the transformation of a terrified widow into something far more formidable. He had seen the same transformation happen in men who had been pushed past their breaking point and come out the other side as something harder and more dangerous than they had been before. He nodded once. Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say when I say it. Do not deviate. They approached the two-story house through the overgrown backyard, moving in a single-file line through grass that had grown knee-high in the months since the foreclosure. The house was a modest, once cheerful suburban home that had fallen into rapid disrepair. The paint was peeling, the gutters sagged, a child's swing set in the backyard, its chains rusted, and its plastic seat cracked, swayed faintly in a breath of wind that came and went so quickly it might have been imagined. Elaine's chest tightened as she moved through the yard, where Rosie had learned to walk, where Garrett had built a raised garden bed and planted tomatoes that never quite thrived in the harsh Texas soil. The ghosts of her former life were everywhere, whispering from the overgrown flower beds and the dark windows. Sledge raised a fist. The column halted. He pointed to the back patio with two fingers. The sliding glass door was ajar, its lock visibly pried. Shards of glass glittered out on the concrete like scattered teeth. Brick's eyes narrowed. He exchanged a look with Ratchet, and a silent communication passed between them. Someone had been here. Someone had already tried to find what Garrett had hidden. Brick signaled for Ratchet and Hawk to flank the perimeter, covering the sides of the house. Then he raised his shotgun, pushing the shattered sliding door open with the suppressor. The metal track groaned softly. The inside of the house was a disaster. Moonlight filtered through the bent aluminum blinds, casting long silver bars across a scene of methodical destruction. Furniture had been overturned. Couch cushions slashed open, their foam innards spilling onto the carpet like entrails. Drywall had been torn out in several places, leaving gaping rectangular wounds in the walls that exposed the wooden studs beneath. Bookshelves had been pulled from their anchors and their contents scattered. This was not vandalism. This was a search. A thorough professional search conducted by people who knew what they were looking for, but not where to find it. Whitmore's men, Brick murmured, sweeping the beam of his weapon-mounted light across the wreckage. They've been through here, probably more than once. Elaine's throat constricted as she stepped through the ruins of her former life. She recognized the couch where she and Garrett used to watch old movies on Saturday nights, now gutted and lying on its side. The bookshelf that had held their small collection of novels and Rosie's picture books, now a pile of broken wood and scattered pages. A framed photograph lay on the floor, its glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Through the fractured glass, Garrett's face smiled up at her, forever frozen in a moment of uncomplicated happiness. She left it where it lay. There would be time for grief later. Right now, there was only the mission. The nursery is upstairs, Elaine whispered, her voice steady despite the wreckage around her. Brick took the point, his boots silent, on the carpeted stairs. He moved up the staircase in a tactical crouch, the suppressed shotgun tracking back and forth across the dark landing above. The house was silent, but the silence felt intentional, as though the building itself was holding its breath. They reached the second floor. 3 doors lined the hallway. The master bedroom to the left, its door hanging open to reveal a similarly destroyed interior. A bathroom straight ahead, its mirror shattered. And to the right at the end of the hall, the door to Rosie's room. It was ajar. A thin sliver of pale light leaked through the gap. Brick pushed the door open with the barrel of his weapon sweeping the room in a practiced arc. The room was clear, but like the rest of the house, it had been searched. The small bed had been flipped, the mattress slashed, the dresser drawers pulled out and dumped. Stuffed animals had been torn open, their synthetic stuffing scattered across the floor like snow. The wallpaper, a cheerful pattern of yellow ducks and white clouds that Garrett had hung himself over a long weekend, was peeling where hands had tested for hidden compartments behind it. Elaine stepped in past Brick and went straight to the closet. She dropped to her knees on the cluttered floor, pushing aside torn clothing and broken toys with controlled, focused movements. Her fingers found the edge of a specific floorboard in the back corner. It looked identical to every other board, which was exactly the point. Garrett had been meticulous. She pried it up with her fingernails, breaking two in the process. The pain barely registered. Beneath the board was a narrow cavity, perhaps 4 inches deep, lined with a scrap of old towel. Resting on the towel was a beautifully carved wooden music box about 6 inches square, its surface decorated with hand-painted wildflowers. Garrett had made it himself in the garage during the weeks before Rosie was born. He had taken a woodworking class at the community college specifically to build it. It played a tinkling, slightly off-key version of You Are My Sunshine. Elaine lifted it out with trembling hands. She turned it over her fingers, running along the bottom until they found the seam that didn't quite match the rest of the grain. She pressed a hidden wooden latch, a clever mechanism that Garrett had designed so that only someone who knew exactly where to press would be able to open it. A small compartment popped open with a soft click. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a silver USB flash drive. It was small, unassuming, the kind of thing you might find in a junk drawer and not think twice about. But Elaine knew with a certainty that resonated in her bones that this small piece of metal and silicone contained the truth about her husband's murder. "I got it." Elaine breathed, clutching the drive to her chest. She pressed the music box to her cheek, feeling the smooth wood against her skin, and closed her eyes. "Garrett, I found it." "Good," Brick said from the doorway, his voice tight. "Now we need to—" A massive spotlight flooded through the nursery window, turning the dark room into a blinding, white-hot stage. The light was so sudden and so intense that it felt like a physical assault, searing through Elaine's closed eyelids and throwing stark, razor-edged shadows across the walls. The screech of tires echoed down the quiet street. Through the window, Elaine could see 3 black SUVs slamming onto the front lawn, their headlights blazing, their doors already opening before the vehicles had fully stopped. "Movement!" Hawk's voice crackled through the radio, clipped to Brick's vest, sharp and urgent. "We got company. Heavy hitters. Boss, these aren't street thugs. Tactical gear. Body armor. Night vision. They're breaching the front door." "They tracked us!" Ratchet yelled from the hallway where he had been covering the stairs. Elaine's blood turned to ice. The momentary elation of finding the drive evaporated, replaced by a surge of primal terror. She clutched the music box and the flash drive against her body, curling around them like a mother shielding a child from an explosion. "Get down!" Brick roared at Elaine, moving with explosive speed. He grabbed her shoulder with his free hand and shoved her into the corner of the nursery behind a heavy oak dresser that Garrett had built to match the music box. "Stay behind this. Do not move." The front door downstairs exploded inward with a deafening crash. The sound of a battering ram hitting reinforced wood followed immediately by the heavy synchronized thunder of multiple boots on hardwood. These were not Vernon Pratt's hired muscle. These were private military contractors, professionals with training and equipment that rivaled government special operations forces. Whitmore had not sent thugs to clean up his mess. He had sent soldiers. Automatic gunfire erupted from the stairwell. The sound was indescribably loud in the enclosed space of the house, a staccato hammering that vibrated through the walls and floor and ceiling and seemed to come from every direction at once. Bullets ripped through the dry wall of the nursery, punching fist-sized holes that let in sharp beams of white light from the spotlight outside. Plaster dust filled the air in a choking white cloud. Brick didn't flinch. He leaned out of the doorway at an angle exposing as little of his body as possible and raised his shotgun. The weapon coughed twice the suppressor, reducing the report to heavy, authoritative thumps. A scream erupted from the stairwell, followed by the sound of a heavy body tumbling down the wooden steps. "Suppressing fire," one of the mercenaries shouted from below. The stairwell lit up with a relentless hail of automatic rounds. Bullets tore through the floorboards of the second story, sending splinters of wood and clouds of insulation spiraling upward. Elaine pressed herself flat against the floor behind the dresser, her face against the dusty carpet, the music box clutched beneath her body. The noise was so overwhelming that it bypassed her ears entirely and registered directly in her chest, a percussive physical force that shook her organs and made her vision blur. But she did not scream. She did not cry. She held the flash drive in her fist so tightly that the metal edges cut into her palm, drawing blood, and she thought of Garrett. She thought of him falling from that catwalk, terrified and alone, dying with the knowledge that the truth he had tried to protect would die with him. And she thought, I will not let that happen. I will not let them bury this. Ratchet, sledge, pincer movement, now. Brick barked into his radio between shots. From outside, the roar of a heavy-caliber rifle shattered the night as Hawk, who had positioned himself on the roof of a neighboring garage, began picking off the mercenaries clustered around the SUVs. The precision was surgical. One shot, one body dropping. Another shot, another body. Hawk worked with the detached mechanical efficiency of a man performing a task he had performed many times. Inside the house, Ratchet and Sledge had slipped out a second-floor window and dropped to the backyard. They breached the house from the rear, moving through the destroyed kitchen, and caught the mercenary team in a devastating crossfire. The cramped interior of the house turned the firefight into something medieval, all close quarters chaos and muzzle flashes in the dark. A mercenary in heavy body armor, his face hidden behind a black balaclava and tactical goggles, breached the top of the stairs. He moved fast and low assault rifle sweeping toward the nursery doorway where Brick was positioned. Brick threw himself into the hallway. He was fully exposed, a massive target silhouetted against the nursery's spotlight-flooded window. The mercenary's rifle barked. A round grazed Brick's left shoulder, tearing through the fabric of his shirt and opening a bright red furrow across the meat of his deltoid. The impact spun him slightly, but he did not go down. With a primal guttural sound that was more animal than human, Brick closed the distance. His left hand shot out and grabbed the barrel of the assault rifle, his grip so powerful that he actually bent the metal. He shoved the weapon toward the ceiling. It fired a burst that punched a ragged line of holes through the plaster. With his right hand, he brought the heavy wooden stock of his shotgun down in a devastating arc that it connected with the mercenary's helmeted head. The helmet cracked. The man dropped like his strings had been cut, collapsing onto the landing in a heap of body armor and tactical gear. Silence descended on the house. It wasn't a natural silence. It was the ringing, pressurized silence that follows extreme violence, a silence that seems to push back against the ears. "Status," Brick rasped, pressing his hand against his bleeding shoulder. The wound was ugly but superficial, the bullet having traced a shallow channel across the muscle without hitting bone or artery. "Clear downstairs." Ratchet's voice came through the radio, slightly breathless. Sledge is securing the back entrance. Hawk handled the drivers outside. We need to move, boss. Cops will be here in 3 minutes. Brick turned back to the nursery. Elaine was on the floor behind the dresser, covered in plaster dust, her hair white with it, her dark clothes gray. She was shaking, her body vibrating with the aftermath of adrenaline. But her eyes, when she looked up at Brick, were clear and fierce. In her right hand, held in a grip so tight that her knuckles had gone white, and her palm was bleeding where the metal had cut her, was the silver flash drive. Brick reached down with his good arm and hauled her to her feet. "You have the drive?" he asked, though he could see the answer. "I have it," Elaine said. Her voice was hoarse from the dust, but underneath the physical strain was something new, something that had not been there before the gunfire started. It was the voice of a woman who had passed through a crucible and emerged on the other side changed. "Then let's go. We're done hiding." They fled through the backyard as the first distant wail of police sirens began to wind up in the Odessa night. The team piled into the Tahoe. Ratchet floored the accelerator, and the heavy vehicle tore away from the curb, its reinforced tires screaming against the asphalt before the armored SUV melted into the grid of industrial side streets and disappeared. When they arrived back at the compound, the atmosphere was electric. Word had spread. The entire club was awake and assembled dozens of men with hard faces and harder hands standing in the yard under the harsh security lights waiting for their president to return. Brick climbed out of the Tahoe, his left arm hanging slightly lower than his right, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage Ratchet had applied during the drive. He ignored the murmurs of concern from his brothers. He ignored the medic who tried to approach with a first aid kit. He walked directly into the church room, his bloodied hand leaving prints on the doorframe. He slammed the flash drive onto the oak table. Ratchet was already there with a laptop. He plugged the drive in, and the screen filled with a cascade of folder icons. Dozens of them, organized with the meticulous precision that had been Garrett Mercer's defining characteristic. Emails, bank transfer records, recorded phone calls, falsified safety inspection logs, photographs of counterfeit valve components, with their serial numbers clearly visible alongside the genuine parts they had replaced. Accounting spreadsheets showing the exact dollar amounts diverted from the safety budget into offshore accounts through Blackwood Holdings. And at the center of it all, a single video file. Ratchet clicked it open. The screen showed a grainy, slightly shaky image captured by what appeared to be a phone camera hidden in a shirt pocket. The timestamp in the corner read 2 weeks before Garrett's death. The setting was an office expensively furnished with a sweeping view of the refinery's sprawling industrial complex, visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 men were in the frame. One was Garrett Mercer, standing stiffly, clearly agitated. The other was a handsome man in his late 50s with silver hair and a bespoke Navy suit seated behind a massive desk. Preston Whitmore. The audio was muffled but audible. Garrett's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "These valves are rated for half the pressure they're supposed to handle, Preston. If the main line spikes during a thermal cycle, every one of these counterfeit components will fail. We're talking about a catastrophic chain reaction. People will die." Whitmore's response was chillingly calm. "And if you file that report, Garrett, people will lose their jobs. Thousands of them. The refinery shuts down. The town dies. Is that what you want, to be the man who killed Odessa?" "I want to be the man who kept it from blowing up." "Then maybe we can come to an arrangement. Everyone has a number, Garrett. What's yours?" Garrett's voice hardened. "You don't have enough money to buy my silence, Preston. Not when the lives of every worker in that plant are at stake." The video ended. The room was silent. Elaine stood in the doorway watching the frozen image of her husband's face on the screen. She was still covered in plaster dust. Her palm was still bleeding, and her cheeks were wet with tears that she hadn't felt falling. That was the last time she had seen Garrett's face alive. Not in person on a screen, captured in a moment of extraordinary moral courage. He had refused to be bought. He had refused to look away, and they had murdered him for it. Brick watched Elaine's face as she processed the video. He watched the grief cycle through her, followed by the rage, followed by something harder and more permanent. A resolve that had been forged in fire and quenched in blood. But Ratchet wasn't done. His fingers flew across the keyboard, opening file after file with increasing speed. His face, usually a mask of sardonic amusement, was growing progressively darker. "Boss, you need to see this." Brick leaned over Ratchet's shoulder. On the screen was a series of internal maintenance reports dated within the last 6 months. They showed a schedule of valve inspections that had been completed and approved. But cross-referencing them with the procurement records on the drive revealed a sickening truth. The counterfeit valves that Garrett had flagged had never been replaced. Not a single one. Ian. "They're still in there," Ratchet said, his voice flat with disbelief. "Every counterfeit component Garrett documented is still installed and operating under full pressure." Whitmore didn't fix the problem after he killed the whistleblower. He just falsified the inspection reports and kept running the plant. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. The Apex Petrochemical Refinery employed over 3,000 workers. It operated around the clock 7 days a week, processing hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude oil through a labyrinth of high-pressure systems. And at the heart of those systems, holding back forces that could level city blocks, were valves that were rated for half the pressure they were being subjected to. The refinery wasn't just a crime scene, it was a bomb. A massive ticking bomb sitting on the edge of a town of 100,000 people. Elaine felt the floor tilt beneath her. The scope of what she was looking at had suddenly violently expanded beyond the personal. This was no longer just about Garrett. This was no longer just about justice for her murdered husband or safety for her daughter. Thousands of people were going to work every morning inside a facility that could detonate at any moment. Thousands of families were sending their husbands and wives and sons and daughters into a death trap, and they didn't know it because the one man brave enough to sound the alarm had been thrown off a catwalk and branded negligent. "How long?" Elaine asked, her voice barely audible. "How long before those valves fail?" Ratchet shook his head. "There's no way to predict exactly. Could be tomorrow, could be 6 months. But the thermal stress data on this drive shows the degradation curve is accelerating." Garrett calculated that peak risk would hit during the refinery's annual maintenance shutdown and restart cycle, which is next week. Elaine finished. She knew the schedule. Garrett had always circled it on the kitchen calendar. The restart cycle, when the entire system was brought back up to full operational pressure after maintenance, was the moment of maximum stress on every component in the facility. The room was absolutely still. Brick looked around the table at his brothers. The Hells Angels were not saints. They were outlaws, men who had built their lives on the margins of society, who dealt in violence and contraband, and operated by a code that bore no resemblance to the laws printed in leather-bound books in courthouses. They had killed men. They had served time. They had done things that polite society would recoil from. But there were lines that even outlaws did not cross. "This man," Brick said, pointing to the frozen image of Preston Whitmore on the screen, "this man murdered a father. He terrorized a mother. He tried to destroy a 7-year-old girl, and he is sitting in a glass tower downtown sipping espresso while 3,000 people walk into a death trap every morning, because he wanted a bigger number in an offshore bank account. Brick drew his combat knife from the sheath on his belt and slammed it into the oak table. The heavy blade buried itself to the hilt, the handle vibrating with the force of the impact. The sound rang through the church like a bell. The police are corrupt. Half the Odessa PD takes consulting fees from Apex. The courts are slow. By the time a federal investigation even opens a file, those valves could blow and take half the town with them. He looked at each man in turn, his steel gray eyes burning. I say this club sanctions Preston Whitmore. I say we tear down his walls, strip him of his power, and deliver the justice he thought he could buy his way out of. And I say we do it before that refinery restart cycle, because if we don't, we're going to be attending a lot of funerals. Ratchet stood up. Yay! Sledge slammed his massive fist on the table. Yay! One by one, every patch member in the room rose to his feet, the ancient binding vote of the club echoing through the soundproof chamber in a unified chorus that carried the weight of absolute irreversible commitment. But it was not Brick who spoke last. It was Elaine. She stepped forward from the doorway, plaster dust still in her hair, blood still on her hand, and the flash drive still clutched in her fist. She looked at the room full of scarred, tattooed men, and she did not flinch. You want to go after Whitmore, Elaine said. Her voice was calm, controlled. And I am grateful for it, but I want you to understand something. This is not just your fight. Garrett was my husband. He died trying to protect those workers. He died trying to do the right thing. I am not going to sit in a back room and wait for someone to tell me it's over. She looked directly at Brick. I am going to be there when Whitmore falls. I am going to be the one who looks him in the eye and tells him why. The room was silent. In the world of the Hells Angels, outsiders did not speak in church. It was a rule as old as the club itself. But Brick held up a hand before anyone could object. She goes, Brick said simply. It's her fight. We're just the muscle. The planning began before dawn and continued through the following day with the focused, relentless intensity of men preparing for a military operation, which in every meaningful sense it was. Ratchet spread the architectural blueprints of the Apex Petrochemical headquarters across the oak table. The building was a gleaming 40-story monument to corporate excess situated in the heart of downtown Odessa's financial district. Its glass and steel facade reflected the desert sky, and its lobby was staffed by a security team that screened every visitor through metal detectors and biometric checkpoints. Whitmore operates on the 39th floor, Ratchet said, tapping the blueprint with a red marker. Private elevator access, biometric security, a dedicated security detail made up of off-duty tactical officers. If we roll up there on the bikes wearing our cuts, we'll trigger a citywide lockdown before we reach the lobby. Sledge cracked his scarred knuckles. So we don't wear the cuts. We don't ride the bikes. We go in quiet. Brick nodded slowly. His wounded shoulder was stiff beneath the fresh bandages, but he ignored the pain with the practiced indifference of a man who had been hurt far worse. Whitmore thinks of us as animals, thugs. He expects a frontal assault. Or worse, he thinks his mercenaries buried us at the house and he's celebrating. We use his arrogance against him. Elaine sat at the table beside Ratchet, studying the blueprints with an intensity that surprised the men around her. She'd been quiet for hours, processing, strategizing. The terrified widow of 3 days ago was gone. In her place was a woman with a clear-eyed understanding of what needed to happen and a willingness to place herself at the center of it. The flash drive has everything, Elaine said, tracing a path on the blueprint with her finger. But a flash drive can be dismissed. Whitmore's lawyers will argue it was fabricated, tampered with, planted. We need him on record. We need his own words, his own admission, captured in a way that can't be contested. Brick looked at her. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that I walk into his office, Elaine said. The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Alone. The room erupted. Ratchet shook his head violently. Sledge actually stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Even Hawk, who rarely spoke and never raised his voice, said a single sharp word of objection. Brick raised his hand. Silence fell. Explain, he said. Whitmore doesn't know me. Elaine said, her voice steady. He knows my name. He knows I'm the widow of the man he murdered. But he has never seen my face. To him, I'm a file. A problem that he paid Vernon Pratt to solve. He thinks I'm broken, desperate, running. She leaned forward. I walk into his office. I tell him I found Garrett's drive. I tell him I want to make a deal. Money for silence. He'll believe it because it's what he expected all along. Men like Whitmore believe everyone has a price because they cannot imagine a world where someone doesn't. And while he's talking, Ratchet said slowly, beginning to see it, I'm recording. Elaine finished. Everything. His own voice, his own words, admitting what he did. That recording combined with the data on the flash drive creates a case so airtight that no lawyer in the country can crack it. Brick stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched. Outside, the distant sound of hammers and engines carried on the morning air as the compound continued its daily rhythms, oblivious to the seismic shift happening inside the church. It's a good plan, Brick said finally, but you're not going in alone. We'll be on the 39th floor before you walk through his door. If anything goes wrong, we breach in 4 seconds flat. Elaine nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. There's one more piece, Ratchet said, pulling a separate folder from the pile. I've been going through the financial architecture of Whitmore's offshore network. The man has $5 million sitting in a Cayman Islands account routed through Blackwood Holdings. All dirty money, budget funds that were supposed to buy real safety valves. That money was supposed to keep people alive, Elaine said quietly. Exactly, Ratchet said. Garrett's life insurance was $200,000. That claim was denied based on falsified accident reports that came directly from Whitmore's office. 2 years of financial ruin, debt, and terror, all because Whitmore didn't want to pay out a policy that his own company was obligated to honor. He looked at Brick. Using the administrative access codes that Garrett copied onto the drive, I can clone Whitmore's biometric authorization and initiate a wire transfer from his offshore accounts. $5 million routed through his own shell company network, deposited into a domestic irrevocable trust with Rosie as the beneficiary and Elaine as the controlling trustee. Can it be traced back to us? Brick asked. No, the transfer originates from Whitmore's own terminal using his own credentials. By the time his bank flags the velocity of the transfers, the money will have passed through 7 international shells and landed in a walled-off domestic trust. From a legal standpoint, it will look like a last-ditch attempt by Whitmore to hide assets before his arrest. The FBI won't touch it without unraveling their own case. Elaine shook her head. I can't take stolen money. It's not stolen, Brick said. It's restitution. That money was supposed to buy the valves that would have kept your husband alive. Consider it the life insurance policy that Whitmore's company owed you and refused to pay. Elaine looked at the table, at the blueprints, at the flash drive, at the room full of men who, by any conventional measure, should have been the last people on earth to care about a widow and her daughter. She thought about Rosie sleeping in the back room of a biker compound, surrounded by men who would rather die than let anyone touch her. She thought about Garrett, who had recorded the most powerful man in Odessa and hidden the evidence in a music box that played You Are My Sunshine. She thought about the 3,000 workers who would walk back into a death trap next week if she did nothing. Okay, Elaine said. Tomorrow. Brick looked at her and something passed between them. Not romance, not attraction, something more fundamental. An understanding between two people who had both lost children to forces beyond their control, who had both been broken by grief, and who had both found in the most unlikely of circumstances a reason to fight. Tomorrow, Brick confirmed, we end this. That night, after the planning was done and the weapons were checked and the suits were procured and the surveillance equipment was tested, Elaine sat alone in the small room at the back of the compound. Rosie was asleep beside her, curled into a tight ball with her stuffed rabbit and the pink coloring book that Hawk had given her. The child's breathing was slow and steady, the deep, trusting sleep of a girl who believed with the unshakable faith of innocence that she was safe. Elaine watched her daughter sleep and felt the full crushing weight of what she was about to do settle over her like a physical load. Tomorrow she was going to walk into the office of the man who had murdered her husband. She was going to look into his eyes and pretend to negotiate while wearing a hidden camera. She was going to be in a room with a killer, separated from help by seconds that might as well be hours. She might not come back to this bed. She might not see Rosie wake up tomorrow. The fear was there. It sat in her stomach like a cold stone, heavy and undeniable. She did not try to suppress it or pretend it didn't exist. She had learned in 2 years of grinding survival that fear was not the enemy. Surrender was the enemy. Paralysis was the enemy. Fear properly harnessed was fuel. She leaned down and pressed her lips to Rosie's forehead. Daddy was brave, she whispered into her daughter's hair. And I'm going to be brave too. For you, for him, for every family in this town that doesn't know what's coming. She lay down beside her daughter and closed her eyes. Sleep when it came was dreamless and deep, the sleep of a woman who has made peace with what the morning will bring. Dawn broke over the West Texas plains, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The colors bled into each other along the horizon as though the earth itself had been wounded, its raw interior exposed to the merciless eye of another July morning. Inside the Hells Angels compound, the atmosphere was a chilling departure from its usual chaotic energy. There was no loud music, no roaring engines, no coarse laughter echoing off the corrugated steel walls. Instead, the yard was filled with the quiet, deadly hum of men preparing for something that could not be undone. But this war would not be fought with baseball bats and chains in a dusty parking lot. It was going to be fought in the sterile, air-conditioned corridors of corporate power with weapons that Preston Whitmore would never see coming until they had already destroyed him. Brick stood at the head of the oak table in the church, a fresh bandage wrapped tightly around his left shoulder. The wound from the mercenary's bullet throbbed with a dull, persistent heat, but he pushed the sensation to the periphery of his awareness, the way he had learned to push pain aside years ago in a prison yard where showing weakness was an invitation to predation. Spread before him were the architectural blueprints now covered in hand-drawn annotations and colored markers indicating entry points, security positions, and escape routes. The operation had been refined through the night into something lean and precise. By 7:30 in the morning, the downtown financial district was beginning to fill with the familiar rhythms of corporate America. Men and women in tailored suits streamed from parking garages and coffee shops, their faces buried in phones, their minds already engaged with the day's agenda of meetings and emails and quarterly projections. Among them walked 3 men who, despite wearing expensive suits, procured from a high-end fence in the early hours, moved with the predatory grace of wolves who had wandered into a pasture of sheep. Brick's broad shoulders strained the seams of his charcoal jacket. The jagged scar on his face drew nervous glances from passing executives, but he walked with such undeniable authority that no one dared stop him or ask for identification. Ratchet and Sledge flanked him, both similarly transformed, but unable to fully conceal the hard edges beneath the tailored fabric. Sledge, in particular, looked like someone had forced a grizzly bear into a three-piece suit, an impression that was not helped by the fact that his scarred knuckles were still visible below his sleeves. Inside a sleek black surveillance van parked across the street from the Apex Petrochemical Tower, Hawk sat behind a bank of monitors, showing the building's security feeds, which Ratchet had tapped into using the administrative access codes from Garrett's flash drive. Beside Hawk sat Elaine. She had changed into a simple professional gray dress borrowed from a prospect's girlfriend who was roughly her size. Her auburn hair is down-brushed until it shone. She wore minimal makeup, just enough to conceal the dark circles and the evidence of 2 sleepless years. In her left ear, nearly invisible, was a microscopic wireless earpiece. Concealed in the modest silver brooch pinned to her dress was a high-definition camera no larger than a shirt button. A headset was pressed to her right ear, connecting her to Hawk's monitoring system and through it to Brick's team inside the building. She looked calm. Her hands rested in her lap without trembling. Her breathing was slow and measured, but beneath the composed exterior, her heart was running at a sprint, pumping adrenaline through her body in quantities that made her fingertips tingle and the edges of her vision sharpen with preternatural clarity. "I have you on the internal feed, boss," Hawk's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Lobby is clear. Security is focused on the main entrance metal detectors. Executive garage access is open." Brick and his men didn't approach the main entrance. They veered toward the private executive parking garage, a separate entrance that bypassed the metal detectors and public security checkpoints. Ratchet pulled a cloned keycard from his pocket, swiped it across the hidden terminal, and the heavy glass doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. They stepped into the private executive elevator. Ratchet plugged a small modified device into the elevator's diagnostic port and bypassed the biometric scanner with a few rapid keystrokes. The elevator began to climb, the numbers on the digital display ticking upward with a soft rhythmic chime. "Clear for floor 39. Ratchet murmured, checking his watch. "Once we step out, we have 4 minutes before the system registers the bypass and alerts his private security detail." Brick checked his suppressed .45, sliding it smoothly back into the shoulder holster concealed beneath his jacket. 4 minutes is a lifetime. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling, opulent reception area bathed in natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of the West Texas landscape from 39 stories was breathtaking, a vast golden-brown expanse stretching to the curve of the earth. A highly polished mahogany reception desk sat empty. Whitmore's executive assistant wasn't due for another 20 minutes. They moved swiftly down the plush-carpeted hallway. At the far end were double doors of frosted glass etched with the words Preston Whitmore Regional Vice President. Brick positioned himself and Sledge on either side of the doors. Ratchet took a position at the corridor junction, covering the approach from the elevators and the emergency stairwell. "We're in position," Brick said softly into his earpiece. "Elaine, you're up." In the van across the street, Elaine took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She thought of Garrett's face on the video, the quiet courage in his voice when he refused to be bought. She thought of Rosie still sleeping in the compound under the watchful guard of 4 armed men. She thought of the 3,000 workers who would file into the refinery next week for the restart cycle, trusting that the systems keeping them alive were genuine. She opened her eyes. "I'm ready," she said. Hawk drove the van around to the building's executive entrance. Elaine stepped out, smoothed her dress, and walked through the lobby with the unhurried confidence of a woman who belonged there. The security guard at the executive desk barely glanced at her. Ratchet had already inserted her name into the digital appointment system using Garrett's copied admin codes. As far as the security software was concerned, Elaine Mercer had a 9 o'clock meeting with the vice president. She took the executive elevator to 39. The doors opened onto the empty reception area. She could feel the presence of Brick and Sledge somewhere nearby, positioned just out of sight, close enough to reach her in seconds. She walked down the corridor alone. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor. The sound was rhythmic, steady, the sound of a woman walking with purpose. She reached the frosted glass doors and paused for one heartbeat, two. Then she pushed them open and stepped inside. Preston Whitmore's office was a monument to wealth and self-regard. The room was vast, dominated by a desk of imported Italian marble that must have cost more than Elaine's former house on Elm Street. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around two walls, flooding the space with morning light that caught the crystal decanters on a sidebar and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. The carpet was so thick and soft that it absorbed the sound of Elaine's footsteps completely. Whitmore sat behind the marble desk, a porcelain espresso cup raised halfway to his lips. He was a handsome man, silver-haired and immaculately groomed, wearing a bespoke navy suit and a Patek Philippe watch that caught the light with every movement of his wrist. He radiated the effortless confidence of a man who had spent his entire career insulated from consequences. He looked up as Elaine entered, and his expression cycled through several rapid phases. Confusion first, then a flicker of recognition as the name registered, then a slow, spreading smile that was equal parts amusement and contempt. "Mrs. Mercer," Whitmore said, setting down his espresso with a delicate clink. "I must say, this is unexpected. My assistant didn't mention a meeting. It was a last-minute addition." Elaine said, her voice remarkably steady. She remained standing halfway between the door and the desk, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate. "I hope you don't mind." Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the appraising gaze of a man who was accustomed to evaluating assets. "Not at all. Please sit down. Can I offer you anything? Coffee, water?" "No, thank you." Elaine remained standing. "This won't take long." "Very well." Whitmore's smile didn't waver. "What can I do for you?" Elaine reached into her small handbag and pulled out the silver flash drive. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, letting the morning light catch the metal surface. Whitmore's smile vanished. The transformation was instantaneous and total. The color drained from his tanned face as though someone had pulled a plug. His manicured hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, gripped the leather so tightly that the tendons stood out like wires beneath his skin. "You know what this is," Elaine said. It was not a question. "I don't know what you're talking about," Whitmore said, but his voice had changed. The smooth, confident baritone had developed a tremor that he could not conceal. "My husband was a careful man, Mr. Whitmore. The most careful man I ever knew. He documented everything. Every counterfeit valve you purchased, every dollar you diverted into your offshore accounts through Blackwood Holdings, every falsified inspection report, and he recorded you in this very office, offering him money to stay quiet." Whitmore's eyes darted to the office door, then to the phone on his desk, then back to Elaine. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of options, the scramble for control. "That recording, if it exists, was obtained illegally," Whitmore said, his voice hardening as he reached for the familiar armor of legal threats. "It would be inadmissible in any court, and I could have you arrested for blackmail." I'm not here to blackmail you, Elaine said. She let the statement hang for a moment, watching the confusion ripple across his features. I'm here to give you a chance to explain yourself, to me, face to face. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Explain what exactly, explain why you murdered my husband. The words landed in the office like a dropped grenade. Whitmore's jaw tightened, his knuckles went white. Your husband died in a workplace accident. Whitmore said each word carefully measured. An accident caused by his own negligence. The investigation was thorough, and the findings were clear. The investigation was fabricated, Elaine said. Her voice remained calm, but beneath the calm was a current of something electric, something barely contained. Garrett didn't fall from that catwalk because he was careless. He fell because you needed him to fall. He found the counterfeit valves, he refused your bribe, and he was going to report everything to the Federal Safety Board. She took a step closer to the desk. Whitmore did not move, but she saw his pupils dilate. So you had him killed, and then you had his death ruled negligent so the insurance wouldn't pay out. And then you hired Vernon Pratt to forge a debt and terrorize his widow because you wanted me so crushed, so desperate, so focused on simple survival that I would never have the time or the strength to look into how my husband really died. She took another step. You thought you'd broken me, Preston. You thought the debt and the terror and the poverty had finished the job. And you were almost right. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in a diner with $14 to my name trying to figure out how to feed my daughter. You almost won. She was at the desk now, close enough to see the individual beads of sweat forming on Whitmore's forehead, close enough to see the pulse hammering in his neck. But you made a mistake. You underestimated my daughter, and you underestimated me. Whitmore stared at her. For a long, suspended moment, the mask of corporate composure held. Then it cracked. You don't know what you're dealing with, Whitmore said, and his voice had changed again. The smooth executive was gone. Beneath it was something desperate and dangerous. I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, security, connections that go all the way to the state capitol. If you walk out of here with that drive, I will destroy you. I will take your daughter. I will make what Pratt did look like a birthday party. The threat hung in the air between them. Elaine felt the cold stone of fear in her stomach, felt it pulse and radiate, felt it try to close her throat and lock her muscles. But she had walked through gunfire 2 nights ago. She had crawled across the floor while bullets tore through the walls above her head. She had held a dying man's legacy in a bleeding fist and refused to let go. She was done being afraid of men in expensive suits. You think you can threaten me, Elaine said, and something in her voice made Whitmore flinch. You think after everything you've done, after you took my husband, after you tried to sell me to a predator, after you sent soldiers to kill me in my own daughter's nursery, you think I'm afraid of your lawyers? She leaned forward, both hands on the marble desk, her face inches from his. I am a mother, Preston, and mothers do not stop fighting, not for lawyers, not for threats, not for anything. Whitmore's composure shattered completely. He lunged for the phone on his desk, his hands slamming down on the intercom button. Security to my office. Now I have an intruder. In Elaine's earpiece, Hawk's voice came through sharp and urgent. Security is mobilizing from the 37th floor. You have 90 seconds. Simultaneously, Brick's voice calm and granite hard. We're coming in. The frosted glass doors of Whitmore's office exploded inward. Brick filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the corridor. Behind him, Sledge moved like a shadow, swift and silent despite his size. Whitmore scrambled backward, knocking over his espresso. The porcelain cup shattered on the marble desk, sending a spray of dark liquid across the polished surface. His eyes were wild, darting between Elaine and the two massive men who had materialized in his sanctum like avenging spirits. Gallagher. Whitmore choked, using the name he had heard from his mercenary team's failed report. Then recognition caught up. Thornton, the biker. My men were supposed to. Your men failed, Brick said, stepping into the room with the unhurried, predatory calm of a man who knows he has already won. Just like you failed. Just like everything you built on blood and lies is about to fail. Ratchet appeared behind Brick, a compact laptop already open in his hands. He moved to Whitmore's desk with practiced efficiency, connecting the flash drive in the laptop to Whitmore's massive desktop monitor. "What are you doing?" Whitmore screamed. "Get away from my system. I'm sending your life's work to the people who need to see it." Ratchet said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The FBI field office in Dallas, the SEC, the Federal Safety Board, every major news network in the state, and the entire board of directors of Apex Petrochemical. He looked up at Whitmore with a cold, humorless smile. "Oh, and I'm also initiating a wire transfer of $5 million from your Cayman Islands account through Blackwood Holdings into a domestic irrevocable trust. Consider it the life insurance policy you owed the Mercer family." Whitmore let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. He lunged for the laptop, but Sledge's massive hand clamped down on his shoulder with a grip that had once been a steel pipe and pressed him back into his chair. "Don't move," Sledge said. It was the first time Elaine had heard the giant speak. His voice was surprisingly soft, which somehow made it more terrifying. Ratchet hit the final key. On the monitor, a cascade of confirmation receipts began to appear, each one representing a data package delivered a domino, toppled a wall of secrecy, breached. The emails, the bank records, the falsified inspections, the video of Garrett's confrontation, all of it radiating outward from this office to every corner of the law enforcement and media landscape. Whitmore watched the confirmations scroll across his own screen and made a sound that Elaine would remember for the rest of her life. It was the sound of a man watching his empire, his reputation, his freedom, his future evaporate in real time. It was a guttural animal sound of pure despair. "Security approaching the 39th floor," Hawk warned through the earpiece. 60 seconds. But Elaine wasn't done. She walked around the desk and stood directly in front of Whitmore. He looked up at her and she saw that his eyes were red and wet. All the power, all the arrogance, all the calculating cruelty had been stripped away, and what remained was a frightened, pathetic old man in an expensive suit who had built his throne on the bones of better people. Garrett Mercer was a good man. Elaine said, her voice carrying the quiet, unbreakable authority of someone who has earned the right to speak. "He was a good husband and a good father. He tried to save 3,000 lives, and you threw him off a catwalk for it. You took him from his daughter. You took him from me." Her voice did not waver. "But you didn't destroy his work. You didn't erase what he documented. And you didn't break me. I'm still standing. And every worker in that refinery, every family in this town, they are going to know the truth. The valves you installed are counterfeits. The restart cycle next week would have killed people. And the man who tried to warn everyone, the man you branded as negligent, is a hero." She reached into her dress and unclipped the silver brooch camera. She held it up so Whitmore could see it. "And everything you just said and did in this room has been recorded. Not from a hidden phone in a pocket, but from a broadcast quality camera that has been streaming directly to a secure server. Your threats against me and my daughter. Your admission that your men were supposed to have dealt with us. All of it." Whitmore's face collapsed. 30 seconds, Hawk said. "Let's go." Brick set his hand on Elaine's arm. Elaine looked at Whitmore one last time, "Garrett sends his regards," she said. Then she turned and walked out of the office without looking back. The team moved fast. They bypassed the elevator, slipping into the emergency maintenance stairwell just as the sound of the private security detail reached the 39th floor from the opposite direction. The stairwell was narrow and dim, lit by harsh fluorescent strips that buzzed overhead. They descended rapidly, Brick's wounded shoulder protesting with every jarring step, Elaine's borrowed heels clicking on the metal treads. They exited through a fire door that opened into a loading dock at the base of the building. Hawk had the van waiting engine running. The doors slid open and they piled inside. Hawk punched the accelerator and the van merged into the morning traffic flow with seamless, invisible precision. Behind them through the van's rear windows, Elaine could see the first police cruisers pulling up to the Apex Tower. Then the unmarked federal sedans. Then the news vans, their satellite dishes already extending upward like antennae sensing a story. It was over. By 9:30 that morning, the corporate plaza around the Apex Petrochemical Tower was a chaotic sea of flashing red and blue lights. FBI Special Agent Richard Miller, a veteran of corporate fraud task forces, stood in the lobby and stared at the mountain of evidence that had been deposited simultaneously into his office, his email, and every major news outlet in the state. Up on the 39th floor, Preston Whitmore was on his knees, his satellite phone in pieces on the floor, after he had confirmed that his offshore accounts had been emptied. His $5 million routed through his own shell company network had landed in a domestic, irrevocable trust that was legally untouchable. When Agent Miller's tactical team kicked open the frosted glass doors, Whitmore didn't resist. He didn't call his lawyers. He simply sat in his chair staring at the confirmation receipt scrolling across his monitor and said nothing. Harrison Caldwell. Whitmore mumbled, using his own middle name as if trying to remember who he was. But Agent Miller didn't care about the man's identity crisis. "Preston Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, racketeering, and willful endangerment of public safety," Miller said, pulling the executive's arms behind his back with a practiced motion. "You have the right to remain silent." By noon, the arrest was the only story in Texas. News helicopters circled the Apex Tower. Camera crews jostled for position outside the federal courthouse, where Whitmore, stripped of his bespoke jacket, was paraded before the world in handcuffs and an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The ticker at the bottom of every screen read the same words in bold red letters: Apex Petrochemical VP, arrested for murder of safety inspector. Counterfeit valves discovered. Refinery shut down for emergency inspection. And across town, behind the corrugated steel walls and razor wire of the Hells Angels compound, a different kind of scene was unfolding. The main common room was silent. A dozen patched members stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glued to the massive flat-screen television as Whitmore's terrified face was broadcast to the world. The perp walk, the reading of charges, the breathless commentary from reporters who couldn't quite believe the scope of what they were covering. Elaine sat in a battered leather armchair in the corner. She was still wearing the gray dress from the operation, though she had kicked off the borrowed heels and was barefoot on the cold concrete floor. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that someone had pressed into her palms at some point, though she couldn't remember who or when. She watched Whitmore's face on the screen. She watched the arrogance drain out of him as the reality of federal handcuffs and a courtroom full of cameras settled over his future. And she felt something that she had not felt in 2 years. She felt the steel band around her lungs, the one that had been tightening every day since Garrett's funeral, suddenly and completely break. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first full breath she had drawn in what felt like a lifetime. The tears came then, not the terrified, stifled crying she had done in motel rooms, in dark alleys, in the back seats of borrowed cars. These were heavy, racking sobs that came from a place so deep inside her that she hadn't known it existed. They were tears of grief and rage and exhaustion, but beneath all of that, beneath the accumulated weight of 2 years of unrelenting terror and loss, they were tears of relief. Her husband was vindicated. His name was cleared. He had not been careless. He had not been negligent. He had been a hero who tried to save lives, and the world was finally going to know it. A heavy, calloused hand gently touched her shoulder. Elaine looked up through her tears. Brick stood beside her, his massive frame blocking the glare of the television. He wasn't wearing his leather vest, just a faded black t-shirt that showed the thick white bandages wrapping his wounded shoulder. His scarred face was unreadable, but his steel gray eyes held something that she had come to recognize over the past few days, a quiet, fierce protectiveness that asked nothing in return. In his other hand, he held two small, steaming mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to Elaine without a word, then walked over to where Rosie was sitting cross-legged on the floor. The little girl was completely ignoring the historic news broadcast playing above her head. She was intensely focused on coloring a picture of a very muscular, heavily tattooed princess riding a dragon that bore a suspicious resemblance to a Harley-Davidson. "Here you go, little bird," Brick said, his low, gravelly voice incredibly soft as he lowered the mug into her small hands. "Thank you, Brick." Rosie beamed, taking a careful sip and getting a perfect rim of whipped cream on her nose. She looked up at the giant, scarred man with the simple, total trust that she had extended to him from the very first moment in the motel room. "Did you fix the bad man?" "Your mommy fixed him, Rosie," Brick said, lowering his massive frame to sit on the dusty concrete floor beside her. "She was the bravest person I've ever met, and I've met a lot of people." Rosie nodded sagely as though this confirmed something she had always known. "Mommy is brave," she agreed. "She fights the monsters under my bed, too." Elaine set her mug down and stood up. She walked over to Brick and, without a word of warning, wrapped her arms around his thick neck and hugged him. The room full of hardened criminals subtly looked away, finding their boots and their beers suddenly fascinating. Brick stiffened. Physical affection that wasn't transactional or violent was a foreign language in his world. But slowly, carefully, he brought his good arm up and placed it across her back. "The trust fund," Elaine whispered, stepping back and wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. $5 million, Brick. Are you sure it's clean?" "Ratchet is a savant," Brick said. "The money traveled through Whitmore's own network. By the time the FBI forensic accountants trace it, it will look like a desperate asset hiding maneuver that Whitmore attempted before his arrest. They can't unwind it without compromising their own prosecution. The trust names Rosie as the sole beneficiary and you as the controlling trustee. It's enough to buy back the house on Elm Street. It's enough to put this little bird through any college in the country. And it's enough to make sure you never have to be afraid again." "How can I ever repay you?" Elaine asked. "You risked your lives. You took bullets. You went to war with a corporation for complete strangers." Brick reached into the paillet of coins. He pulled out a crumpled, heavily creased $1 bill, still bearing the faint, sticky residue of clear tape. Behind it was the torn diner napkin with the purple crayon writing, "To buy a new jacket. Please don't be sad." "You don't owe me anything, Elaine Barchier," Brick said softly, looking at the napkin. "Your daughter already paid my fee in full." 3 weeks later, the West Texas sun was shining over Elm Street, with a warmth that felt, for the first time in Elaine's memory, more like a blessing than a punishment. The neighborhood, usually quiet and orderly, was buzzing with a strange, slightly nervous energy as suburban curtains twitched in living room windows. The Montgomery house had been transformed. The overgrown grass was freshly mowed. The broken windows were repaired. The shattered front door had been replaced with a solid oak one with a brass knocker and a heavy deadbolt. The peeling paint had been scraped and reapplied in the same warm blue that Garrett had chosen the summer before Rosie was born. The garden bed, long dead and neglected, was freshly turned and planted with young tomato plants that wouldn't thrive in the harsh soil but would be loved anyway. The bank foreclosure had been reversed by a team of high-priced Dallas lawyers. The life insurance claim had been reopened and paid in full with interest by an insurance company that was now desperate to distance itself from its association with Whitmore's fraud. Garrett's employment record had been corrected, the negligence finding expunged and replaced with a commendation for bravery. Elaine stood on the front porch wearing a simple sundress, a gentle breeze rustling her auburn hair. She was watching Rosie draw an elaborate sprawling chalk mural on the freshly pressure-washed driveway. The mural depicted a large bird carrying a dollar bill surrounded by smaller birds and flowers and what appeared to be a motorcycle with wings. A familiar low thunderous rumble echoed down the suburban street, vibrating the pavement and drawing every eye on the block. Ratchet's black armored Tahoe pulled up to the curb, flanked by two massive Harley-Davidsons. The engines rumbled for a moment, then cut to silence. Brick swung his leg over the bike and kicked down the heavy steel stand. He wasn't wearing his intimidating club colors today. Instead, he wore a simple white t-shirt that revealed the sprawling canvas of prison tattoos and club ink covering his thick arms. The scar on his face caught the sunlight. He looked exactly like what he was, a dangerous man who had, for reasons that the neighbors would never fully understand, become a guardian. "Brick!" Rosie shrieked, dropping her pink chalk. She sprinted across the freshly cut lawn with the headlong, fully committed velocity of a child who has spotted someone she loves. The terrifying enforcer of the Hells Angels caught the 7-year-old mid-stride, lifting her high into the air as she giggled with uncontrolled delight. He set her down gently and walked to a saddlebag, pulling out a small, beautifully wrapped box. "Got something for you, little bird," he said, handing it to her, "since you paid for it and all." Rosie ripped the wrapping paper off with the pure, concentrated ferocity of a child on a mission. She threw the lid off the box and gasped. Inside, smelling of rich new leather, was a tiny custom-made motorcycle jacket. It was an exact painstaking replica of Brick's own cut, complete with heavy silver zippers, reinforced shoulders, and sturdy stitching. But instead of the terrifying winged death's head logo on the back, Hawk had spent 3 days meticulously embroidering a custom patch, a small, fierce yellow bird in mid-flight, carrying a single green dollar bill in its talons. Underneath the bird, in neat block letters, were the words "Little Bird." "It's a new jacket," Rosie squealed immediately, slipping her small arms into the stiff leather sleeves. It fit her perfectly. She spun around on the driveway, the leather catching the sunlight, the yellow bird on the back seeming to fly as she moved. "Look, Mommy, just like Brick's." "Just like mine," Brick said, and the deep, jagged scar on his cheek softened completely, transforming his normally terrifying face into something warm and unguarded, and almost but not quite peaceful. Elaine walked down the driveway carrying a tray with 3 glasses of ice-cold lemonade. She handed one to Brick and one to Ratchet, who had leaned against the hood of the Tahoe with his arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression that suggested he was trying very hard to maintain his tough guy reputation while simultaneously fighting the urge to smile. "You know you're completely spoiling her." Elaine laughed, though her eyes were shining. "Somebody has to," Brick replied, taking a long drink of the lemonade. He looked at Elaine, seeing the color back in her cheeks, the light back in her hazel eyes, the straight-backed posture of a woman who no longer walked through the world expecting to be hit. She had survived the fire. She had done more than survive it. She had walked into it voluntarily and come out the other side carrying the truth. Brick knew he could never fully leave the club. The brotherhood of leather and iron was etched into his bones, and the violent life he led would always be a part of him. The territorial dispute with the El Paso crew was still waiting to be resolved. There were debts to be collected and threats to be answered, and the endless churning machinery of the outlaw world to be managed. But something had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible. The hollowed-out shell that he had been for 8 years, the weapon without a purpose beyond the next act of violence, had been cracked open by a 7-year-old girl with a purple crayon. And through that crack, something that he had believed dead and buried had begun tentatively to grow again. He looked down at Rosie, who was now trying to convince Ratchet to let her braid his hair. Ratchet was protesting in a way that made it very clear he was going to give in within approximately 30 seconds. Brick reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the playing card that Rosie had given him in the motel room. The King of Hearts. He had carried it every day since, next to the dollar bill and the purple crayon note. "You know," Brick said quietly, looking at Elaine, "after Nora died, I told myself that the world was nothing but cruelty and that caring about anything was just giving the universe a target. I spent 8 years building walls so high that nothing could get through. And then your daughter walked up to my bike with a dollar bill and a crayon and knocked the whole thing down." Elaine smiled. It was the first full, unreserved smile she had worn in 2 years, and it transformed her entire face. "She gets that from her father," Elaine said. "Garrett always said that the smallest act of kindness can change the trajectory of a life. He believed it completely. He lived it." She looked at the house, at the blue paint in the new door and the tomato plants in the garden bed, at her daughter spinning on the driveway in her tiny leather jacket, laughing with a joy so pure and so boundless that it seemed to push back the shadows of the world simply by existing. "He was right," Elaine said softly. "He was right about everything." Brick nodded. He drained the last of his lemonade, set the glass on the tray, and walked to his bike. He threw his leg over the massive machine and fired the engine, the familiar thunderous roar echoing off the suburban houses and rattling the windows. He looked at Rosie, who had stopped spinning and was watching him with those enormous blue eyes. "You take care of your mommy, little bird," Brick called over the rumble of the engine. "I will," Rosie shouted back, standing very straight in her new leather jacket, her small fist pressed over her heart in an imitation of a salute that she must have learned from watching the club members. "And you take care of yourself, Brick, and eat your vegetables." A sound escaped Brick's throat that might, under laboratory conditions, have been classified as a laugh. It was rough and unused and slightly painful, like a door that hadn't been opened in years, but it was real. He kicked the bike into gear and rolled down Elm Street, Ratchet following in the Tahoe. The rumble of the engines faded slowly, absorbed by the vast open landscape of West Texas, until the only sound left was the hiss of the neighbor's sprinkler and the scratch of chalk on concrete as Rosie returned to her mural. Elaine stood on the porch for a long time, watching the empty street where the bikes had been. Then she went inside the house and walked upstairs to the nursery. The room had been repaired and repainted, the walls fresh and white, the cheerful duck wallpaper replaced with a soft lavender that Rosie had chosen herself. The music box sat on a shelf above the new bed, its hand-painted wildflowers catching the afternoon light. Elaine wound the small brass key on the side. The tinkling, slightly off-key melody of "You Are My Sunshine" filled the room, each note landing gently in the quiet air. "We did it, Garrett," she whispered. "We brought you home." Years later, framed on the wall of the Hells Angels clubhouse directly above the mahogany bar, sits a single crumpled $1 bill, alongside a torn diner napkin with purple crayon writing. Beside them in a simple wooden frame hangs the King of Hearts. The dollar bill is faded now. The tape residue has yellowed with age. The purple crayon has dimmed from vibrant to soft like a sunset settling into dusk. But no one in the club has ever touched the frame. No one has ever suggested moving it or replacing it with something more fitting for a room full of outlaws. It remains a silent, untouchable testament to the day a 7-year-old girl, armed with nothing but a dollar and a crayon, reached into the darkest corner of a broken man's soul and found against all odds that there was still a light burning there. And the monster she saved her right back.